I was browsing Craigslist looking for antique items for my collection when an ad caught my attention, a collection of Victorian dolls at an incredibly low price. The ad included little information, but the photos showed beautifully detailed dolls with delicately painted faces and elaborate dresses. I knew I had to see those dolls up close. I scheduled a visit for the next day, eager to meet the seller, an old man named Harold. I drove to the provided location, which was at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by tall, dense trees. At the end of the path, I spotted an old mansion, imposing but clearly decrepit, with time leaving its marks on the faded walls and dusty windows. There was something melancholic about the house, as if it held secrets that preferred to remain hidden. As soon as I parked, Harold appeared at the door, an elderly, thin man with a slightly hunched posture, but with eyes that sparkled with a strange intensity. Harold greeted me warmly and invited me inside. The mansion's interior was even more impressive than I imagined, full of antique furniture and heavy curtains. He led me to a room upstairs, where the dolls were arranged in a glass display case. I was amazed by the collection. Each doll looked like a work of art, with facial expressions so detailed they almost seemed real. Harold, noticing my fascination, began to tell the story of the dolls. They had belonged to his late wife, a passionate collector of such items. He spoke fondly of her, but there was a sadness in his voice that made it clear the loss was still painful. As Harold spoke, I felt a strange sensation of being watched. At first, I thought it was just the house's atmosphere, but soon I realized the dolls seemed to be subtly watching me, as if their heads moved slightly when I looked away. I tried to dismiss the thought as my imagination, but the feeling persisted, making the already shadowy room even more oppressive. Harold, perhaps noticing my discomfort, casually mentioned that the dolls held great sentimental value, but that he was willing to sell them because he felt it was time to move on. There was something in the way he said this that made me uneasy, but my fascination with the dolls was stronger. We negotiated a price, and I left the mansion with several of them carefully packed in boxes. As I drove home, I couldn't stop thinking about the strange encounter and the unsettling feeling I had in Harold's house. However, I was excited about the addition to my collection, not imagining what was about to happen. When I got home, I placed the dolls in one of the rooms I use as a display space for my collection. I spent hours rearranging the room so that the new pieces could be highlighted, and the satisfaction of finding such rare items outweighed the strange discomfort I had felt in Harold's mansion. That night, as I observed the dolls, I was amazed by the level of detail, the faces, the glass eyes, the meticulously arranged hair. Each doll seemed to have its own personality, which made them even more fascinating. It was when I was getting ready for bed that things started to get strange. I was already in bed, almost asleep, when I heard a low noise, like a whisper. I sat up in bed, trying to identify the source of the sound, but the house was silent. I convinced myself it was just the wind or my mind playing tricks on me, so I lay back down. However, the whispers continued, always on the edge of hearing, almost as if they were coming from within the walls. The next morning, when I entered the room where I had left the dolls, I felt a chill. The dolls were not in the position I had left them. One of them, which had been facing the window, was now directly facing the door, with its glass eyes fixed on me. Others were slightly moved, as if they had been shifted during the night. I tried to rationalize, thinking that perhaps I had moved them myself without realizing it, but the idea didn't seem to fit. There was something unsettling about the way they were arranged, as if they were reacting to my presence. In the days that followed, things only got worse. The whispers at night became more frequent and intense, until I began to hear them clearly as I approached the room where the dolls were. They were soft, indistinct voices, but laden with something that seemed to be a mix of lament and anger. One night, the whispers became so loud that I woke up in a panic, certain that someone was in the room. When I turned on the lights, I found the dolls out of place again, some turned towards the wall, others looking directly at the bed. Fear began to take hold of me. Every time I entered the room, I felt like I was being watched, not just by the dolls but by something I couldn't see. The atmosphere around the dolls seemed increasingly heavy, oppressive, as if they were absorbing the house's energy and turning it into something dark. I started researching the dolls' origins, trying to find some clue that could explain what was happening, but I found nothing specific, just vague reports of old dolls carrying residual energies. One night, after another terrifying experience, I decided I couldn't keep those dolls in my house any longer. They were consuming me, turning what had once been a pleasure into a nightmare. I decided I would return them to Harold the next morning, determined to get rid of them as quickly as possible. I slept poorly, tormented by disturbing dreams in which the dolls were alive. whispering secrets I couldn't understand. The next morning, I packed the dolls back into their boxes as quickly as I could. The feeling of relief as I took them out of the house was immediate, but there was also a growing anxiety at the thought of returning to Harold's mansion. Something told me that what I had experienced was just the beginning, and that returning the dolls might not be enough to end what had been unleashed. With the dolls packed and ready for return, I drove toward Harold's mansion with a growing sense of urgency. The dirt road, lined with towering and shadowy trees, seemed even more isolated and oppressive that morning. With each mile traveled, my determination to get rid of the dolls increased, accompanied by a fear I couldn't explain. I just wanted to hand those things back and never think of them again. When I finally reached the end of the road, the sight of the mansion made me stop abruptly. Something was wrong. The house, which had previously seemed decrepit but still habitable, now looked completely different. The windows were broken, and the garden, which, though neglected, still showed signs of life, was now completely overrun by weeds and uncontrolled vegetation. The mansion had an aura of abandonment that I hadn't noticed before, as if it had been forgotten long ago. Confused, I got out of the car and approached the door. I knocked several times, but no one answered. The knocks echoed through the empty house, reinforcing the feeling that there was no one inside. The door, strangely, was ajar, and I pushed it slightly, entering the mansion with a mix of reluctance and curiosity. The interior was in an even worse state than the exterior. Furniture covered in dust and cobwebs, a smell of mold filling the air, and the absolute disturbing silence that seemed to weigh on everything. I walked through the house, calling for Harold, but the only response was the muffled sound of my footsteps on the wooden floor. I went to the room where, days before, Harold had shown me the dolls. To my surprise, the glass display case was empty, and there was no sign of the other dolls I hadn't bought. Everything seemed like a scene of abandonment, as if no one had lived there for years. But that was impossible. I had been there, talked to Harold, negotiated the dolls. How could the house be in this state now? A horrible idea began to take shape in my mind. What if Harold had never really been there? What if the house had been abandoned all along, and what I saw and experienced was something different, something I couldn't explain? A sense of terror overcame me when I realized that perhaps the dolls weren't the only haunted things in that mansion. Determined to get out of there as quickly as possible, I returned to the entrance, but before leaving, I saw something that paralyzed me. On the ground near the door, there was an old for sale sign, fallen among weeds and dust. I picked it up and felt a chill as I read the information. The house had been for sale for more than 10 years, abandoned after the death of the last owner, whose wife had been a great doll collector. The dates and details matched the story Harold had told me, but how was that possible? I dropped the sign on the ground and ran to the car without looking back. As I sped down the dirt road, I couldn't stop trembling. The mansion had been abandoned for years, but I had seen Harold, talked to him, bought the dolls. Nothing made sense. But one thing was certain, I needed to get rid of the dolls immediately. The feeling that something very dark and dangerous was happening was inescapable, and I didn't want to be part of it any longer. When I got home, I didn't waste any time. I took the boxes with the dolls to the basement and left them there, locking the door behind me. But the relief I felt was fleeting. That night, as I tried to sleep, I heard the whispers again, louder and clearer than ever, as if the dolls were calling me, waiting for me. I knew I hadn't escaped them, and that whatever was linked to those dolls and Harold's mansion was still watching me, waiting for the next opportunity. I was in a tough phase as a writer. Inspiration seemed to have abandoned me, and every word I typed felt empty, lifeless. It was during one of those frustrating days that I came across an ad on Craigslist that captured my attention. Antique Underwood typewriter for sale. Belonged to a famous horror writer from the 1930s. The words famous horror writer intrigued me, and something inside me said that this typewriter could be exactly what I needed to regain my creativity. The ad included little information, but the image of the typewriter was impressive. It looked to be in excellent condition, with wrought iron keys and a structure that emanated an aura of something very old, almost timeless. The seller, a woman named Elisa, arranged to meet me at a cafe downtown for the handover. I was anxious all day, waiting to see what the typewriter could offer. When I arrived at the cafe, Elisa was already there, sitting in a corner with the typewriter beside her. She was a tall, thin woman with a calm, almost distant expression. She greeted me with an enigmatic smile and quickly moved on to the story of the typewriter. She said the machine had belonged to her grandfather, a reclusive writer who had become famous for his horror stories, although few people knew his real name. According to her, he wrote tales so terrifying that many believed he had some sort of supernatural inspiration. Elisa mentioned that after her grandfather's death, the typewriter had passed through several hands, but that all the previous owners had suffered some kind of tragedy. She said this casually, as if she were telling an anecdote, which made me laugh nervously. When I asked if she wasn't afraid to sell the typewriter, she just smiled and said, "Maybe you'll be the next to discover what it can do." There was something unsettling in the way she said this, but my curiosity was greater than my fear. I paid for it and took the typewriter home. That night, I placed the typewriter on the table, admiring its antique design. The sound of the keys was satisfying, the kind of sound modern keyboards can't reproduce. I decided to try writing something immediately, and the words began to flow surprisingly easily. However, as I typed, I noticed that the words appearing on the page were not what I had planned to write. Instead of a fictional story, what emerged was a macabre description of a car accident, with such vivid and horrifying details that I felt nauseous. I turned off the light, tried to forget what had happened, and went to bed. But that night, I dreamed of the accident, seeing everything with disturbing clarity, the car flipping over, the trapped victims, the smell of gasoline. When I woke up, the dream was still fresh in my mind, and something told me it wasn't just an ordinary nightmare. When I checked the day's news, there it was, a car accident exactly like the one I had written about, occurring the night before. The next morning, still disturbed by the dream and the news of the accident, I sat down again in front of the typewriter. There was something inexplicable about that machine, something I couldn't understand, but that attracted me like a magnet. I decided I needed to find out if what had happened the night before was just a coincidence or if there was something more. With trembling hands, I started typing again. This time, I tried to write a completely different story, something lighter, but the typewriter seemed to have a will of its own. The words that appeared on the page were not what I intended to write. Instead, detailed descriptions of a house on fire emerged, with people trapped inside, screaming for help. I tried to stop, but my hands kept typing, as if they were controlled by an invisible force. The result was another macabre story, full of horrifying details that I could never have imagined on my own. When I finished, I felt a wave of nausea overcome me. It was as if I had been forced to witness a terrible scene, but even more disturbing was the feeling that it was more than just a story. Trying to stay calm, I went to the kitchen and turned on the radio to distract myself, but what I heard left me in shock. There was a fire in a house in a nearby town, exactly as I had described. The reporter spoke about the victims who couldn't escape, and his words seemed to echo the ones I had just written. I spent the day in a daze, trying to understand what was happening. It was impossible to deny that the stories I was writing were becoming reality, and it terrified me. It wasn't just a coincidence. Something in the typewriter was manifesting the words in the real world. But how? And why? It was as if the machine was connected to a force far beyond my comprehension, a force I couldn't control. In the following days, I tried to resist using the typewriter, but it was as if it were calling me, begging to be used again. When I finally gave in, what I wrote was even worse than before, a premonition of a bus accident, with details that made me break out in a cold sweat. I tried to destroy the sheet immediately after writing it, but it was too late. The next day, the news was everywhere. A bus had overturned on a winding road, with numerous victims. I knew it was my fault. Fear began to take hold of me. If I continued to use the typewriter, how many more of these terrible premonitions would I bring to life? But the most frightening thing was that the more I tried to resist, the stronger the urge to write became. It was as if the typewriter was alive, influencing my thoughts, forcing me to feed its hunger for tragedy. I felt like a puppet, controlled by something I couldn't understand. Meanwhile, I started investigating the history of the typewriter and its previous owners. What I discovered was even more disturbing. All the writers who had owned the typewriter before me had suffered tragic deaths or mysteriously disappeared. Some were found in grotesque scenes, similar to the macabre descriptions they had written. The typewriter, it seemed, not only created premonitions but also cursed those who used it. I knew I had to get rid of it, but the idea of simply throwing it away seemed impossible. It was as if the typewriter had a connection with me, something I couldn't break. And the more I fought against it, the more the feeling of despair grew. I was trapped in a cycle of horror, and each new story I wrote only made things worse. Determined to end the nightmare that the typewriter had brought into my life, I began planning how to get rid of it. Each day, the presence of that machine in my house felt more suffocating, as if the darkness it brought was seeping into every corner of my being. My only hope was to return the typewriter to Elisa, the seller who had given me that cursed object. Perhaps she knew how to break the connection that had been created between me and the typewriter. I tried calling Elisa several times, but the number she had given me was disconnected. Each call ended in an unsettling silence, as if mocking my attempt to find a solution. I decided to go back to the address Elisa had given me when we met, hoping to speak to her in person. Deep down, I was afraid of what I might find, but I had no other choice. When I arrived at the building where she had said she lived, I felt a chill run down my spine. The building was old, with dirty windows and walls worn by time. I climbed the creaking stairs to the indicated floor and knocked on the apartment door. No one answered. I knocked again, harder this time, but the only response was the echo of my own knocks reverberating down the empty hallway. Finally, I tried the door, and to my surprise, it was unlocked. I entered the apartment, calling out for Elisa, but the place was completely empty. There was a heavy silence in the air, interrupted only by the distant sound of cars on the street below. The apartment seemed to have been unoccupied for a long time, with furniture covered in dust and no evidence that anyone had lived there recently. My heart began to beat faster. It was as if Elisa had never been there. As I explored the place, I found an open drawer in an old desk. Inside, there was a single yellowed sheet of paper with familiar handwriting, mine. The text was a description of a disappearance, detailing how a woman had mysteriously vanished, leaving behind only an old typewriter. My stomach turned as I read those words. It was as if I had predicted Elisa's disappearance without even realizing it, or worse, as if the typewriter had forced me to write it. It was then that I understood the extent of the horror I was involved in. Elisa hadn't sold the typewriter to me by chance. She was part of a cycle, a kind of guardian who passed the curse on, perhaps hoping to rid herself of it. And now, with Elisa gone, I was next in line. The typewriter was with me, and whatever had cursed its previous owners was now haunting me. Desperate, I decided to get rid of the typewriter once and for all. I carried it back home, intending to destroy it. I took a hammer and tried to break the machine into pieces, but each blow seemed to be absorbed by it, as if the metal was invulnerable. I tried setting it on fire, but the flames didn't touch it, burning around it without leaving a mark. The typewriter was indestructible, protected by a force I couldn't understand. Slowly, the terrible truth began to reveal itself. The typewriter couldn't be destroyed, and I was condemned to carry it with me, just like the previous owners. Every attempt to rid myself of it only strengthened its connection to me, and the idea of passing the curse on to someone else, as Elisa had done to me, was unthinkable. I couldn't inflict this fate on anyone else. That night, the typewriter began to behave in an even more disturbing way. Even when I wasn't using it, the keys would type on their own, producing words I didn't want to read. They told stories of death, of disappearance, of terror that was getting closer and closer to me. I knew I was losing control, and that eventually, I too would disappear, just like Elisa, just like all the others. Now, as I write these final words, I feel that my time is running out. The sound of the keys, once a source of inspiration, is now a sign of my own end. I know that soon, it won't be me writing anymore, but the typewriter, telling my final story. And when that happens, all that will be left of me will be this narrative, a warning to whoever finds this machine. But please, if you're reading this, don't touch it, don't take it into your home. Because once you start writing, there will be no escape. I've always been passionate about art, especially old and mysterious pieces. There's something about works that carry the weight of time that has always drawn me in, as if each painting or sculpture has a story to tell. It was this fascination that led me to search for unique paintings on auction sites and marketplaces. And it was during one of these searches that I found an ad that caught my attention. An old painting, seemingly worthless, but which emanated a strange energy even through the computer screen. The seller, a young man named Tom, seemed eager to get rid of the piece, offering it at a ridiculously low price. The description in the ad said the painting had been found in an attic during a renovation, and that it seemed to have a peculiar aura. Intrigued, I contacted Tom, and we arranged to meet so I could see the painting in person. When we met, I noticed that Tom was nervous, as if he wanted to get rid of the painting as quickly as possible. The painting itself was strange but fascinating. It showed a small town, with cobblestone streets and old houses of European architecture. painted in dark and worn tones. The sky in the painting was an oppressive gray, giving the scene a heavy and melancholic atmosphere. But what caught my attention the most were the tiny figures painted along the streets, ordinary people, but whose faces seemed blurred or partially erased, as if they were just shadows of themselves. Tom, noticing my interest, began to talk about the painting's origin. He said the painting had been found during the renovation of a very old house, and that since then, whoever had kept the painting experienced a growing sense of discomfort. "I think there's something wrong with this painting," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Ever since I brought it home, I feel like I'm being watched. And the people in the painting, they seem to change places when I'm not looking." I laughed nervously, thinking Tom was exaggerating. But something in the way he spoke, in the urgency in his eyes, made me feel a slight chill. Even so, my interest in the painting was stronger than the fear. I paid for the painting and took it home, already imagining the perfect place to hang it on the living room wall. Little did I know that by bringing that painting into my home, I was bringing something much darker and more inexplicable than a simple work of art. When I got home, I hung the painting on the living room wall, in a prominent place where I could admire the details whenever I passed by. The work had a strangely hypnotic quality. Despite its dark tone, there was something captivating about the way the small town was portrayed, with its empty streets and gray sky. During the day, the painting seemed just like another intriguing addition to my collection, but at night, the atmosphere around it began to change. On the first night, as I walked through the living room on my way to the kitchen, I noticed something strange. The figures in the painting seemed to be in slightly different positions from what I remembered. I stopped to observe more closely, but I couldn't determine if it was just my imagination. The people on the streets of the painting, who had previously seemed like mere blurs, now seemed more defined, as if they were moving out of the foggy background. A chill ran down my spine, but I decided to ignore the feeling and went to bed. In the following days, the sense of discomfort began to grow. Every time I walked through the living room, I had the impression that the figures in the painting were watching me, their heads slightly turned toward me, their indistinct eyes following my movements. I knew it was irrational, but I couldn't help it. I began to avoid looking directly at the painting, but its presence seemed to grow in the room, as if it were becoming the focal point of the entire house. One night, after waking from a restless sleep, I went to the living room to get a glass of water. As I passed by the painting, I felt an irresistible urge to look at it again. What I saw made me freeze in place. The figures in the painting had clearly changed position. Where they had once been scattered along the streets, they were now all grouped in a single spot in the painted town, as if they had gathered to observe something. The most disturbing part was that a new figure had appeared, one I was certain hadn't been there before. The new figure was at the bottom of the painting, near the point where the streets converged. It was more distinct than the others, and although the face was still partially erased, something about it seemed familiar. A sense of panic took hold of me. It was as if the painting was trying to show me something, as if there was a sinister story being told through the subtle changes in the figures. I decided I needed to investigate more about the painting's origin and find out what was happening. I began researching online and in local libraries, trying to find information about the town depicted in the painting and about the painting's possible origin. What I discovered was more disturbing than I could have imagined. The town in the painting seemed to be a representation of a real village that had been practically abandoned in the late 19th century due to a series of mysterious disappearances. Historical records indicated that over 100 years, dozens of people had disappeared without a trace, and some of the physical descriptions of these people seemed to match the figures in the painting. My mind was spinning with questions and theories, but one thing was clear: the painting wasn't just an innocuous piece of art. It seemed to be connected to something much darker, something that might now be manifesting in my own home. I stayed awake all night, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the figures in the painting were moving again, trying to show me something terrible. The next morning, the dread I felt intensified when I realized that something had changed again in the painting. The figures that had gathered in the center of the town were now spreading out through the streets once more, but with an alarming difference: a new figure had appeared. This time, the image was clearer, and when I looked closer, my heart froze. The figure was of Tom, the young man who sold me the painting. I recognized his appearance, the coat he was wearing the day we met, even the way his head was slightly tilted, as if he were trying to protect himself from the cold. My mind refused to believe what my eyes were seeing, but the evidence was right there in front of me. Tom, who had disappeared from my life as soon as he sold the painting, was now immortalized in the painting, like the other blurred figures. I needed to understand what was happening, and the only way to do that was to find Tom and confront him. Maybe he knew more about the painting than he had told me. I tried calling Tom, but like Elisa in the story of the typewriter, his number was disconnected. I decided to visit the address he had given me, hoping to find him. I drove to the old neighborhood where he said he lived, a place that, in itself, already had a sense of abandonment, as if time had stopped there. When I arrived at the building, a complex of old, gloomy apartments, I felt a déjà vu of the day I tried to find Elisa. I climbed the creaking stairs and knocked on his apartment door. No one answered. I knocked again, harder, calling his name, but still, there was no response. I decided to try the door, and as expected, it was unlocked. Tom's apartment was in a similar state to Elisa's, empty, dusty, as if no one had lived there for a long time. But what disturbed me most was the fact that, on a table in the corner of the room, there was a small pile of mail, all dated weeks before I had met Tom. I stopped in front of the table, flipping through the letters. They were all bills and eviction notices, suggesting that Tom had disappeared some time ago. And then, beneath the letters, I found something that made me tremble. It was a crumpled piece of paper, covered with Tom's shaky handwriting. The words were disjointed, as if he had written in a state of panic, but what I could decipher left me in shock. The painting. They got me. I'm trapped. Inside. Don't let it take you too. I ran out of the apartment without looking back. The reality of what was happening began to solidify in my mind. The painting wasn't just a piece of art. It was a trap, a prison for those who somehow connected to it. Tom had been sucked into the painting, and I knew that if I kept the painting in my house, I could be next. Back at my house, I couldn't take my eyes off the painting. Now, with Tom's figure clearly visible, I knew the painting was showing me what would happen to me if I didn't get rid of it. But how do you get rid of something that seems to be alive, something that seems to have a mind of its own? I decided I had to destroy it before it was too late. I took the painting and carried it outside, determined to burn it. However, as soon as the flames began to engulf the painting, something strange happened. The figures in the painting began to move frantically, as if they were trying to escape the flames. Tom's face, previously indistinct, was now clearly visible, his eyes full of panic. I felt a wave of terror and guilt as I saw this, but I continued with my decision, stoking the fire. But then, just as the painting should have begun to disintegrate, the flames suddenly went out, as if an invisible force had extinguished them. The painting was unscathed, and the figures, including Tom, now seemed to look at me with an expression of despair and sadness. It was as if the painting was trying to warn me, trying to show me that it couldn't be destroyed, and that any attempt to do so would only make things worse. Now, with the painting back in my house, I realize I'm in an impossible situation. I can't destroy it, I can't get rid of it, and each day, I feel like I'm being drawn more and more into the painting. I know that soon, I too will be just another figure in the dark streets of that town, and that someone else will find the painting, continuing the cycle of horror. I just hope that person understands the warning I'm leaving behind. Be careful with what you bring into your home because some things can't be undone, and some fates are worse than death.